Okay, so we're ready to start. And as you can see, I want to speak with you about what just transpired in Glasgow. I guess it's actually still ongoing. And I want to change the focus from the way in which I've spoken with you about climate change in the past. And in the past, we've spoken about the scientific, the humanitarian, the ecological dimensions of climate change. I really want to focus on the political dimensions of climate change. And the reason is simple. The little images I have here to start today's lecture, we've got the ongoing negotiations at the COP summit in Glasgow, where the world is trying to reach new accords, new goals, set new guidelines, put in place different mechanisms for funding both the mitigation from the damage to climate change and the effort to prevent climate change from becoming a runaway catastrophe. And then we've got the protesters, right? And that's last Friday, but these protesters occurred again this Friday, and I think with even more anger, disappointment, and vehemence as a result of what the accords, what the negotiations have failed to accomplish. And then there's a sculpture. I'm sorry, I did not write down the name of the sculptor, so I can't credit it. But this sculpture is called Politicians Speaking About Climate Change. And as you can see, they are mainly underwater, right? And of course, we're thinking about rising sea levels as polar ice caps melt, and the idea that the people negotiating in Glasgow fail to understand the urgency of the issue faced. That's what the protesters are protesting, the inadequacy of the agreements being hammered out. And so I think if we're going to look at climate inaction, and I want to be as clear as possible, that's not really fair. And in ways I'll show you in just a moment, we are acting on climate change. We are just acting too slowly. We are acting without a sufficient sense of urgency because, and let me put this in the most direct way possible. If you were a betting person looking in on the planet Earth from some safe distance, and you were just being purely rational, what's the best bet? Should you bet for or against the idea that humanity will survive climate change? I believe most objective observers would say you should vote, you should bet against, right? That the likelihood is that we're not going to be able to generate the political capacity, will, collective action necessary to solve this problem before we unleash uncontrollable forces that will make our planet uninhabitable for our species. That is chilling to say out loud. It's beyond sobering. But I think if we're going to face this in a clear-headed way, if we're going to both understand why people under 30 are so angry at the generations above them for failing to deliver to them a planet in which they will have the freedom to grow up, enjoy the beauty of nature, have the full range of action that we have, that you've got to understand what they understand, which is that our actions are insufficient to the dimensions of the problem that we face. And that, in a sense, this decade is our last best chance for arresting climate change before it becomes uncontrollable. And what we're doing is dithering. We are not acting with the urgency that the situation demands. How can we explain that? And I want to suggest that the explanation is primarily political. So that's where we're going today. Very quickly, and I'll review this very quickly because we've talked about this already. Um, we now know, and I want to say, we can't know this with absolute certainty, but what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has suggested to us on the basis of the best available evidence, and of course, that's the way we always act. We are almost never in possession of certain knowledge, but we have sufficient evidence to make an educated judgment. What the world's leading scientists, and not just a few of them, a whole body of them assembled across the world, suggest is that we have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by at least 45% this decade, by 2030, if we are to avoid a global temperature increase of 1.5 degrees or more. And by the way, if we limit it to 1.5 degrees, these same scientists say there's a 50-50 chance we will avert global catastrophe, right? So, and to be clear, generally speaking, if somebody told you, here's a gun with 2 bullets in it, please pull the trigger. I'm sorry, with 1 bullet in it and 1 empty chamber, right? It's a 2-chamber gun. Please pull the trigger. You would say, no way, right? I don't like those odds. At least give me 7 chambers. What the scientists are saying is to get to the point of 50-50 odds of averting catastrophe, we have to reduce emissions by 45%. And by the way, there's absolutely insufficient movement on that at Glasgow, right? And so when we look at this in a little bit more detail, and again, I want to try to provide a little bit of background, but not concentrate here. There have been a series of agreements, starting with the Kyoto protocols of 1999. Please note that the United States did not, in fact, participate in Kyoto. I shouldn't say we didn't participate. We didn't commit to the protocols that emerged from Kyoto. Then followed by another set of agreements coming out of Copenhagen in 2007, followed by the Paris Climate Accords of 2015. And of course, it's Paris that is most important. And I want to be clear, in each of those phases, the United States has been a major impediment to action. 2015, focusing on Paris for a moment, there are numerous reasons that Paris is an accord as opposed to a treaty. And to be clear, right, the difference has to do with the kind of sanctions that are put in place. Paris is a transparency regime. It says that countries will make pledges and then countries will report on how they're doing in meeting their pledges. There's no enforcement mechanism. One large reason that Paris is an accord and not a treaty with an enforcement mechanism is because although Barack Obama and his administration strongly favored the Paris Accords, they also recognized that with Mitch McConnell in control of the US Senate, there was no way, if they made this a formal treaty, the treaty would be in fact endorsed by the Senate. And so the treaty would not be binding on the United States, and that would be worse than merely having an accord. That's similar, by the way, to what happened with the Kyoto Protocols. And we know this domestically, the United States has whipsawed back and forth between presidents, administrations, control of Congress, with a party that is more inclined to act on the basis of climate science and to try to be a world leader on the issue of climate change, and a party that has, for substantial periods of its recent history, rejected climate science as a, quote, Chinese hoax, or suggested that the evidence is insufficient to warrant the kind of sacrifices that policy would require of us. And so the US does not have a record of leadership on this, but it's also the case that the forces that were constraining the possibility of Paris generating a more forceful agreement are not American alone, right? They're Chinese, they're Russian, they're Saudi, they're European as well, right? And so we still have the Paris Accords in place. And as you can see, if we had continued on the trajectory we were on before the Paris Accords, the situation would be truly disastrous. However, we have not, in fact, the world has not, in fact, stayed the course of the Paris agreements. We have transparency, so we know this now, but we've fallen well short of what we've pledged, and what we've pledged falls well short of what we need to do to secure that 50-50 chance of avoiding a catastrophe. And so looking now from a mile high at negotiations that have been going on since the 1990s, I think what we can see is a lack of will and a lack of capacity, right? The nations of the world have not developed the political will to tackle this problem. And even if they had the political will, then there's the question of how we actually implement a binding treaty sufficient to make nations accountable for their emissions. Again, reviewing very quickly, just giving you a little bit more information, looked at from the current historical moment, what you can see is that the four largest emitters in the world are continuing to emit greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, gases that trap the sun's energy in our atmosphere, that therefore elevate the temperature of the planet and set off a cascading series of events that accelerate climate change, global heating. And so you're familiar with the melting of the polar ice caps and the declining albedo effect of those then white big caps on the planet as they recede and are replaced by brown earth, green plants, green oceans. More of the heat's energy is absorbed by the surface. Similarly, as rainforests convert into savanna, as the world heats up, the rainforests lose their capacity to pull the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And so as we heat, we unleash natural forces that accelerate the process that we are initiating by putting so much carbon into the atmosphere. China is the largest and the most rapidly growing emitter of greenhouse gases in the world today. It is building coal-fired gas plants at a lightning pace to provide electricity for its rapidly urbanizing and modernizing populations, to feed its industries, etc. Right? The United States is the second largest emitter. And please note, if you do a population comparison per capita, the United States is still the largest emitter. And again, right, neither China nor the United States has done what it pledged. The United States is, in fact, doing considerably worse. China a little bit worse than it pledged. The US pledges were more aggressive, and then, of course, were rapidly followed by the election of Donald Trump, a climate change skeptic who withdrew the United States from the Accords, who overrode the Obama era policies on, for instance, tailpipe emissions from cars. And we are, I think, moving rapidly back on course. The in a sense, good thing about a regulatory regime that has a lot of inertia built into it is that it takes a long time to change. And the US has been moving in the wrong direction for 4 years. But fortunately, a lot of those changes have not taken effect. Nevertheless, we are far off where we need to be. European Union doing a little bit better, India doing better still. And I just want to mention very quickly part of the story in India. And to be clear, it's not the whole story. A lot of this has to do with economic recession in India caused both by COVID and by policies. But some of this also has to do with an American policy adopted under the Obama administration of assisting in solar electrification of India, providing US guarantees for banks that will fund these projects so far. If I've got it right, I haven't looked it up recently, but the rate of default was very low, so the US was not in fact on the hook. But the fact that the United States was willing to guarantee these loans made banks willing to give them to support solar electricity projects that are, in a sense, much more efficient, not only in terms of their greenhouse emissions, there aren't any, right? And this, I want to be as clear as possible. If we're going to turn the corner on this, we need to do two things immediately. And when I say immediately, over the next decade, as fast as you can turn the globe's energy production and use system. On the one hand, we have to move away from internal combustion engines at all levels and move to electricity as the fuel that powers an industrial, post-industrial, late modern world. And then the second thing we have to do is change the model of electricity production from a model that extracts fossil fuels from the earth and burns them, taking carbon dioxide stored in the earth for millions of years and releasing it into the atmosphere, into a model that takes the energy already in the atmosphere from the sun, from the wind, in the oceans, from the lunar currents, and converts it into electricity, right? And ultimately, that's a cheaper, more efficient way of getting our electricity. It's also the only way the planet survives. India has started doing that. The United States is dragging its feet, but it's doing it a little bit. Europe is doing it more. China is the real laggard here. But having said that, India is doing it in part because Europe, the US, the world is assisting it financially in doing it. And so this, I think, opens up a window into what we would want from Glasgow and what we're not getting from Glasgow, which is to say the most advanced economies and societies of the world assisting the rest of the world financially in making the transition into a modern economy that is powered by electricity that is generated cleanly. Now, to move to a bit more of a comparative perspective to see the justice of what I've just said. And one way to think about this is per capita. And as you can see, when you shift to a per capita perspective, actually the United States is the worst offender in the world. That's 2014 data, which gives us a bit more of an array. This is 2019 data. And as you can see, we're almost 2-to-1 worse than China in terms of per capita emission of greenhouse gases. And then when we shift to a historical perspective, and I think this is extremely important to appreciate, right? Europe really began the Industrial Revolution, which is coextensive, coincidental with the greenhouse gas revolution. And so all the way back to the 1850s, Europe is emitting extensive amounts hundreds of billions of metric tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. The United States doesn't get there quite as quickly, but eventually it surpasses Europe and becomes the biggest emitter in the world. Other developed countries, mainly in Europe, but outside of the European Union, are also getting there in the 20th century. Russia, second half of the 20th century. China, really beginning only in the 1970s and 1980s, does it begin to become a substantial polluter. The rest of the world, again, it's the last quarter of the 20th century. And so when we look at this then in terms of the overall carbon dioxide in the atmosphere right now, the US is responsible for the largest share, 25%, followed by Europe, 22%, followed by China, 12%. And I want to be, again, as clear as possible, right? We've got less than 4% of the population, but 25% of the admissions, right? And China obviously has a much larger population and half the amount of overall emissions. And if we adhere to the basic principle that those who do the damage are most responsible for compensating for that damage, right? Basic principle of justice. The Americans, we have the largest responsibility here, followed by the Europeans. And so if we are going to do something about this, we're going to have to foot part of the bill. And again, this is a global problem. We cannot solve this problem unless China and India and Brazil and Indonesia are on board. But having said that, we won't solve the problem if we simply ask them to bear the full cost of the necessary measures. So I hope this helps to clarify a little bit about what we need to do. Let me now explain just for a moment why we need to do it. And I want to spend just a moment on this diagram. And this explains some of the costs. And as you can see, we've got glaciers melting, we've got rivers getting eaten up by drought, we've got coastal erosion, we've got terrestrial ecosystems declining or collapsing, we've got wildfires consuming forests, we've got marine ecosystems collapsing. And then when we look at human environments, we've got the threat to food production, the threat to livelihood, health, and economics. And you can see the risk level here, right, depending upon whether we contain the damage below 2 degrees or go up to 4 degrees. And then we have it broken down by continent. And even if you just focus for a minute on the human risks per continent, as you can see, every continent in the United States faces substantial threats to livelihood, health, and economics. Most also face substantial threats to food production. And if we then try to make this a little bit more concrete, I've shared this with you before. This is a project done by a couple of very interesting, important environmental artists, Helen and Newton Harrison, working in conjunction with a number of scientists, trying to predict what happens to Europe with a 4 degrees Celsius climate change. And as you can see, right, the habitable territory of Europe contracts by about 3/4. Some of it is underwater, some of it becomes arid desert. And the result is that Europe, after 4 degrees climate change, sustains only about 10 to 15% of the population that it sustains today. Today, 420 million people. In that hotter world, 45 million people can live in Europe. And where do those 375 million people go? That is the catastrophe that is facing the United States. That is why those young people are so angry. They are wondering whether they can responsibly bring new human life into this world without knowing whether this world will be habitable or can sustain human life in anything like the numbers that it sustains it today. So, COP26, what happened, right? And why are they so angry? There are agreements on carbon reduction, but mainly this is kicking the can down the road. This is saying, come back next year with more concrete goals because we can't do it this year. The Saudis, the Russians, but countries across the world have been unable to agree. By the way, India is a big exception here. Modi agreed to be carbon neutral by 2070, right? And so he's giving his country 50 years, but at least that's a concrete, specific time frame and goal. There's a new bilateral agreement between China and the US. Again, very vague, no enforcement mechanisms. There's a quip in one of the people writing about this, one of the professors saying, if I suggested to my students that they might want to read this book and didn't hold any exams or require any papers, how many of them do you think would actually do the work, right? And this is the problem with these agreements. Right now, we're just asking countries to make pledges without being specific about what we need from them or having any mechanism to hold their feet to the fire. A third aspect of what happened in COP26 in Glasgow is a new methane gas agreement. And I want to be clear, we're going to have to examine and look at the details to see how adequate it is. But methane is actually a much more efficient greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. I've been talking with you primarily about energy, electricity, but actually our food system is also very much responsible for a lot of greenhouse gases. Some scientists estimate that as much as a third of the heating that we're seeing can be attributed to agriculture, not to energy. And the methane gas agreement is beginning to acknowledge this and beginning to work on this. And 7 major automakers, not all of them, but many of the world's largest automakers indicated that by 2030, they would get 70% of their fleets to be electric only. So again, some substantial progress. And I want to be as clear as possible. We need these agreements. This is much better than this conference not having happened, than Paris not having happened. And yet, we are far from where we need to be. So necessary, but not sufficient, urgent, but not yet effective, I think is the takeaway from these international summits on climate change. I do want to point out that there is action elsewhere. And some of you may have seen, I believe it was July of this year, the German High Court ruled against the German parliament that its climate change legislation was a violation of the rights of young people who brought suit, who under the German constitution have an equal right to freedom. And the idea is that if we don't do better on climate change, we will not be as free as you are now to do what you want to do with your lives. And the German High Court agreed and told Parliament it had to fix its legislation. I think that's extremely interesting and important. Again, we need an international framework, but international frameworks are only going to be implemented at the national domestic level if there can be substantial domestic progress, any means available, please. important ruling against Shell in the Netherlands in May of this year, right? In which a court held that Shell needs to be held responsible not only for the emissions that occur during its extraction of fossil fuels, but also for the burning of the fossil fuels and the emissions that that generates. And the court gave Shell some time to repair its business model, but it makes it clear that there is potential liability in the future for private producers in terms of the environmental damage they've done. That's much more difficult to prove in the United States, but at least Shell is headquarters in the Netherlands. And then at Chevron and Exxon's annual shareholder meetings, motions were passed by shareholders, or new people were appointed to the board of governors who demand that the model, the entire business model of these major oil producers shift away from oil production in the name of the future sustainability of profits from these companies. But clearly these are activist measures. Now, having said all of that, right, so there is action elsewhere, there is action in Glasgow. There are major issues still to be resolved. And as I've already suggested, the most urgent of those issues is how we can put in place an adequate international system for lowering carbon and methane and other greenhouse gas emissions, and for holding nations accountable. But in addition to that, right, the idea of the distribution of costs for measures and damages is extremely important. Who will pay for the conversion of electricity from coal-fired to solar in China? Who will pay as low-lying nations have to relocate? Who will pay as whole regions lose their economic viability and the people of those regions have to move elsewhere? And I conclude this portion with the famous quote from Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan from 1651: "Covenants without the sword are but words, and have no strength to secure man at all." So clearly, we need more than a voluntary agreement. Let me now point to what we tend to talk about when we talk about climate change, and that is the growing of the world's population. And yes, of course, we wouldn't be dealing with this issue if we didn't have nearly 8 billion people on the planet, if we didn't have a rapidly modernizing, industrializing form of society, if we weren't increasingly an information technology society that required vast sums of electricity to support the kind of standard of living that we are accustomed to in the West and that most of the rest of the world aspires to. But having said that, I think that's not where we need to focus. We need to focus not on the science of climate change, but the politics of climate change. And here I want to suggest a number of issues. The first is that the development of technology and the scale of human civilization mean that our actions increasingly carry the potential for systemic effects. We are changing the entire environment of our planet. We are causing extinctions. We are causing ecosystems to change rapidly or to collapse. We are disrupting ocean currents and polar ice caps in ways that it's very difficult to understand, right? The science involved here is enormously complex, involves the interaction of systems that are very difficult to determine exactly what causes what. And therefore, right, we are in a world where we are, for the first time, not able to see or understand the way in which our immediate local action unleashes cascades of events that tumble across the planet. Um, in addition to that, the systems that we uh, interact in are hard to predict, and in particular how they will change when disrupted. So right, we are surprised by how quickly the polar ice caps are melting. We are also surprised by where the fresh water that is going into the Arctic is filtering down into the Atlantic Ocean. It's going much more quickly south than we anticipated. This is relevant because it affects the relative salinity of the ocean, which is actually one of the drivers of the big conveyor belts that circulate warm water north and cold water south that maintain the temperate climates in the entire Atlantic Ocean region, which of course includes both America and Europe, uh, America broadly construed, right? The interaction between the elements are indeterminate, and therefore these systems are stochastic. And by that, it means we don't get gradual linear change, right? As opposed to slow and steady melting of the ice caps, we are now seeing cliffs, right? Where there's a rapid change that we had not anticipated, had not adequately modeled. This is in part a problem for science and for our power to predict. It's especially a problem for common sense. And I'll say just a little bit about this now, a little bit about it more, but we have a very strong psychological tendency to believe that the world as it is and was represents the world as it will be. It's very hard for us to imagine a world that is radically different from the world in which we inhabit. We also, as human beings, have a very strong tendency to discount the future in our planning. We tend to be very much focused on our immediate goals. There are probably adaptive reasons that our brains have developed in these ways. We have the capacity to overcome those tendencies, right? To use our higher cognitive power to alter our understanding of time, of risk, of our interest in the future, but we're not naturally inclined to do that. It's hard work. And so again, to just point to the last aspect here, the change is non-linear. There are tipping points, phase transitions, cascades, avalanches. These are all metaphors for describing the fact that these changes occur in unpredictable ways, and that our politics is not well suited to anticipating and working proactively to prevent these changes from occurring, because after they occur, their effects are irreversible and uncontrollable, right? And so that this is the next aspect that makes politics difficult here, which is that we are increasingly unleashing processes that we cannot control once they're started. And this is difficult for us to anticipate or intuitively understand. Our evolved and contrived modes of collective action, that which we do naturally together, and that's which we ask our governments to do, and our governmental structures assist us in doing, are not built for this world. They're built for a simpler, slower, less interconnected world, and we are therefore increasingly vulnerable to global catastrophic risk. And so, right, we need to evolve the political capacity. Why can't we, right? What I've just said to you, although we are not wired necessarily to digest it intuitively, is not that hard to understand. And once you understand the magnitude of the consequences of inaction, that we could exterminate our species, that we could radically disrupt biological life on the only planet that we have. It seems like we should be able to focus on this, understand this, and act on this. Why can we not? Well, let me start with a basic idea. And I'm drawing on Mihan Christ here, a scholar at Columbia University, writes a lot in a variety of popular publications on climate change, not only on climate change, by the way. And this is from an essay published a little bit more than a year ago in the London Review of Books called "Is It Okay to Have a Child?" Right. So this goes back to that problem we started with. And she says in that essay, among other things, the real choice we face is not whether to eat meat or how many children to have, but how to make profound and rapid structural changes, without which no personal choices will matter. I believe in the possibility of human flourishing on this planet while also acknowledging the profound barriers already in place and the profound risks, which are not shared equally, posed by ecological catastrophe. And I want to really focus on this idea that we need rapid structural change. We need to change our energy systems, both what powers our mobility and our lifestyle, and what generates the power that powers all of that, right? We need that change and we cannot produce it individually. Therefore, we need political action. Now, in terms of the calculus of that political action, I want to be as clear as possible. There will be short-term costs, right? And those short-term costs may be disruptive. They may prevent us from doing what it is we currently enjoy doing. And it may be that it will be, in fact, uh, necessary for there to be some global redistribution of income and resources, a transfer from the north to the south, from the developed countries of the world to the undeveloped countries or less well developed countries of the world. And this is necessary, but also fair and just. Again, Christ gives us, I think, a clear, lucid description. She says, the future will always be more terrible and wonderful than any of us can possibly imagine. What will the climate crisis look like in 10 years, 20 years, 50 years? We don't know. How fast can we achieve global decarbonization, right? That's the goal. We don't know. This uncertainty both inspires dread and allows for the possibility of hope, not the false hope that global economies driven by fossil fuels will be able to keep chugging along as they have for too long already, or that the comforts, excesses, and relative safeties of industrialized nations will be preserved, but hope for the possibility of human flourishing in unprecedented and yet unimaginable circumstances. And I think it's really important to keep that in mind, right? If 50 years ago, you would have said to yourself, in 2021, I'll be attending lectures that are given by a professor in New York while I'm living in California, right? You would have thought you were crazy, right? Or either that, some sort of weird technological futurist. We don't know how we're going to cope with this, but we have to muster not only the resolve, but the hope to believe we can solve it. So now, let me focus more specifically on the politics of the West. And I want to be as clear as possible. The West has been the largest historical polluter. The West still is among the largest emitter of carbon dioxide and methane in the world. And the West has the resources to allow us to fund the rest of the world's transition into a decarbonized economy. Will we do it? Can we do it? How can we not do it in light of the magnitude of the threat that we face and the certainty of the evidence that it will do catastrophic damage if we do not act with urgency? And here I'm going to start thinking now about the domestic politics in the West of resisting change. And I want to start with a quotation we've looked at together before. This comes from Ezra Klein's Why We're So Polarized. And what I want to explain is why it is that in most countries in the world, at least most developed democracies, climate change is a polarizing issue. It's not a consensus issue. One of the columnists for the New York Times said about climate change, pretend it's aliens, pretend that an civilization, an extraterrestrial hostile enemy was shooting a laser beam at our planet and heating it. What would we do? Would we come together to resist it? And his answer was implicitly yes. But because it's us who's doing this to us, we seem incapable of uniting in action. Ezra Klein, I think, begins to give us the start of an explanation. And this has to do with so-called identity protective cognition and motivated reasoning, the idea that when a position is integral to your identity, you are recalcitrant to the evidence that tells against that position. And being resistant to the idea that climate change is real or urgent, or that the policies required by it are in fact priorities, or that the West owes a debt to the world, has become integral to an array of political identities throughout the developed world, especially in the United States, Canada, Australia, Britain. And I'll say a little bit more about that later. So here's what Klein says, describing the work of Dan Kahan, a psychologist who teaches at Yale Law School. Dan Kahan's work suggests that cognition exists on a spectrum, ranging from issues where the truth matters and our identities don't, to issues where our identities dominate and the truth fades in importance. One implication of an era where our political identities are becoming more sorted and more powerful is that it will bring with it a rise in identity protective cognition. And that's particularly true if the relevant identity groups are able to construct sophisticated architectures of information that we can use to power our reasoning. And to be clear, the last clause in this passage is referring to Fox News, the right-wing media ecosystem, the idea that it's possible to trot out an apparently credible scientist to deny that climate change is real, or to deny that it is caused by human action, or to deny that the science about in terms of what to do about it gives us clear advice. So if on the one hand, right, denying climate change has become a culture war issue, it's integrated into our political identities. And on the other hand, we have an information ecosystem to suggest that there's credible reasons to deny it, then we are going to be recalcitrant to the argument on the other side. Klein continues, Kahan is quick to note that most of the time people are perfectly capable of being convinced by the best evidence. There's lots of disagreement about climate change and gun control, but almost none over whether antibiotics work. Our reasoning becomes rationalizing when we're dealing with questions where the answers could threaten our group. And in those cases, Kahan says, we're being perfectly rational when we fool ourselves, right? In a sense, we are wired to preserve and protect our identities. And if not being aggressive about climate change has become central to our political identities, we will not be aggressive about it, will not be convinced. Now, to conclude, I want to ask the next question. How did climate change become a polarizing culture war issue? And I'm going to go someplace I bet you wouldn't necessarily anticipate I would go. I'm going to look at global income level changes as the transition to a global economy occur. To do this, I'm going to draw on the great Belgian economist Branko Milanovic and his book Global Inequality. This may be familiar to some of you who have long memories. He shows that in the period in which globalization took off, three big trends happened. The first is that the people who were quite poor, globally speaking, and here you can think of Chinese and Indian peasants, actually saw their incomes increase rapidly in the 1990s, in the first decade of this century, some of them going up by 40, 50, 60, 70, or almost 80%. A second big trend, and that's point B on this graph, has to do with what happened to the middle class of rich countries. And that's the people we're really focused on. And as you can see, many of them had zero income growth for a quarter of a century or more. Many of them had very diminished income growth. And it's not till we start getting up to the top 95, 99, 0.01% that we begin to see rises in income that are approaching those of the global middle class. So three things happening at the same time, right? Many people in the world, people who were peasants in China and India, are getting much more income, right? And that means that they start to move to cities, use electricity, drive cars, eat beef. That's a very important part of the story. But this coincides with people in the developed democracies of the world seeing their expectations of ongoing upward economic mobility or even basic economic security shattered at the same time, right? And finally, the plutocrats becoming even richer. And I want to suggest, right, the people who are gaining in wealth are the people who are consuming the resources that are accelerating climate change. The people who are losing wealth are the people whose politics often resist doing anything about climate change. Why is that? And I want to be as clear and direct as possible. It's because they are angry and resentful, and they've come to identify globalism with a new elite who are getting rich while undermining their economic viability, and they're angry at these people. And remember, the big dividing line within the developed world is between those with a college education and those without. The people with the college education, as we've moved over into skilled bias labor, labor that rewards high education, they're doing okay. It's the people who are excluded from higher education, who didn't acquire it based on their expectations from an industrial economy, who are left out and angry and blame the educated for their indifference to their suffering, for the unfairness of the distribution of income, for violating the basic social contract. And if it's the educated, or if it's perceived to be the educated, are saying, whoa, we've got to pay attention to climate change, this is a big problem coming, you can see that resentment being fed into an idea, we're not going to listen to you. You don't care about us. Why should we care about what you care about? And then you add to that the fact that the plutocrats often have a vested interest in maintaining a fossil fuel economy and have the resources with which to manipulate the global middle class who've been left out of the wealth that globalization is creating. And you've got a perfect recipe for a toxic politics. Let me just drill down on this a little bit, right? US income inequality rising while global income inequality is declining, right? The inequality in the developed economies of the world growing and growing and growing and growing, right? That's the Gini coefficient over the last 60 years, their rate of income growth declining, the rate of the share of wealth that labor gets declining, the level of unionization declining, the number of people working in the services increasing while those working in industry and agriculture decreases. Milanovic summarizes this. And by the way, a lot of these diagrams are from Adam Przeworski's Crises of Democracy. He does a really good job explaining the growth in inequality in the developed world as a whole. Milanovic says technology, openness, and policy. Technology, openness to global trade, policy that's become significantly less redistributive. All of this is what has contributed to the declining equality, the declining viability of the global middle class, while the global plutocracy has gotten richer, and uses its resources to fight against climate change, in part by manipulating the domestic politics of the developed world. I know I'm running out of time. I want to conclude by looking a little bit more at these politics and point out to you that there is a growing consensus, at least in the United States today, that we need to do something about climate change, right? And that there is also, on the other hand, polarization. And if you look at the division between liberal Democrats and conservative Republicans on these issues, it is quite sharp. But I want to now move away from a simple partisan perspective and into a more complicated perspective, and drawing here on the work of Anthony Leiserowitz at Yale. He runs the Yale Climate Change Communication Project. He thinks there's 6 main groups in the United States: those who are alarmed, those who are concerned, right? And that gets us to almost 60% of the population who's either alarmed or concerned about climate change. Those who are a little bit more cautious, they haven't made up their minds. Those who don't know anything about it, don't care very much about it. Those who doubt it's happening, and those who dismiss the idea that it's happening. And so I want to be as clear as possible. If we focus on the doubtful and dismissive, we're talking about 20% of the population. If we focus on alarmed and concerned, we've got 55, 60% of the population, right? There are a lot more people alarmed and concerned than there are people doubtful or dismissive. But the doubtful and dismissive are better organized. They have coalesced into an issues public. They are lobbying, they are active, they are out there on the news. Why is that? Because there is money behind them, because they are aggrieved, resentful, angry, and this is a good way to channel that anger, and it has been funded by the likes of the Koch brothers' billion-dollar investment in climate change denialism and the politics of resentment. And so part of the problem, right, is that those who are alarmed have not coalesced into an issues public, are not organized, are not voting on this basis. One of the people who I was reading on this says this is a high valence issue. People care about it. It's not a high salience issue. They put other issues above it. And unless and until the people who are alarmed or concerned start working more to make this a political issue that they vote on in the same way that the members of the NRA vote on gun control, we are not going to see this emerge as a make or break issue for any politicians or political party in the West. I want to conclude, and I call this an epitaph. I certainly hope it's not, but looking back to Martin Luther King's proclamation close to the end of his life in 1967, when he came out against the Vietnam War, he said, "Over the bleached bones and jumbled residues of numerous civilizations are written the pathetic words, too late," right? And we are very close to that point today. I think the problem is not a lack of understanding, a lack of concern. The problem is political. All right, so I'll stop there. It looks like I've already got a couple questions or thoughts in the chat. Good. Right from Piedmont Garden, if you're interested in learning more about sustainable practices in food production and diet, please join our dietitian, Rachel, for a presentation this Monday. Wilma saying, thank you for bringing that, and you're welcome, Wilma, right? So who wants to start us out with a question or a comment? Have you been following what's happening at COP? Do you want clarifications? I'll do my best. Or do you want to talk about domestic politics of climate change? By the way, you may be able to hear there's a little bit of extreme weather occurring outside my window right now. Heavy rain, thunder, and lightning, as if on cue. Who wants to start us out? Too sobering and distressing to want to offer a comment about?
Okay, let me ask a question.
Hi, Bonnie, go ahead.
You were talking about electricity being the solution to a lot of problems. What about air traffic? Are there ever going to be electrified planes?
Yeah, so great question, and especially as we start billionaire space race, right? And I don't know if you're following how much emissions one of those Bezos rockets lets out, but they're pretty bad, right? The battery technology will have to improve an awful lot for us to have electrified planes. And I've done a little bit of reading on this. Some of the people who are most interested in thinking about it, I think, in still kind of very much pipe dream scenarios, but it starts out that way and then it makes its way into more viable engineering problems. Are envisioning planes that are capable of recharging in the air, right? And so you may be aware, the American Air Force does this, right? It refuels planes in flight. And so part of the question is, could we have atmospheric solar arrays that transfer electricity to planes in flight? I don't think we're anywhere near that yet. The alternative would be some sort of battery that really has much greater capacity than we have right now. There's a lot of research being done, but the batteries are much, much, much better than they were 5 years ago, 10 years ago, right? And for those of you who follow this, you may know that now an electrical vehicle typically has a range of 300 to 400 miles, right? 5 years ago, that was around 100 miles. 10 years ago, that was around 50 miles. So we're seeing exponential growth in battery capacity, but flying a plane is a totally different thing than driving a car. And so it might be that over time, we will develop this technology. Alternatively, over time, it could be, and this is the alternative scenario, we have reduced the carbon emissions from a whole bunch of other stuff, from electricity use, from ground-based transportation. We make air travel actually cover the cost of its externalities, right? The cost of getting the carbon out of the atmosphere that the plane puts into it. What does that mean? That means probably planting trees for the time being. That seems to be the most efficient way we have of capturing carbon. And you may know there are some travel programs right now where you pay a certain amount extra to actually plant trees in proportion to the amount of carbon dioxide that they attribute to you from taking a plane. So all that to say, I think you're right to point at that as one of those areas where it's going to be complicated, it's going to be hard. I think the good news, and I think it's really important to see this, is that at this point, the kind of electrification I'm talking about, right, both getting rid of internal combustion engines and replacing them with electrical power sources, and converting our electrical production system from a fossil fuel-based system to a solar, wind, and water-based system. This is not only possible, it is affordable. And that program I was talking a little bit about in India, where we have subsidized India in creating solar electricity, that program has proved actually to create jobs in the United States as well as in India. And so I think it's worthwhile noting that whereas 10 years ago, doing what we needed to do involved making a lot of sacrifices, today, I think we're actually able to envision a world that sustains something like the quality of life we take for granted, but is much less environmentally destructive.
Okay, question.
Hi, Flossie, go ahead.
What do we do with Senator Manchin? He represents the coal mining people.
Yeah. And
He doesn't have enough vision to understand that if you do something about the people who need jobs and who need bread, and that's why they need to work in the coal mines,
yeah.
can he not, is he incapable of understanding what he represents? Is it more than that he has to answer to his constituency? Is there something deeper than that? Can I don't want to wipe him off the face of the earth, but there's something so utterly helpless but despicable about him.
Well, so let's start with Senator Manchin, but move from him to a deeper
Yes, please.
explanation. And the first thing to note is if you could somehow, magically disappear Senator Manchin. Let's not think in terms of political violence, please.
Yes.
There's enough of that going around already. But if somehow some Harry Potter scenario, we could zoom him off to some other place on the planet, and it takes him a long time to get back. By then he's been replaced. Do you think he's going to be replaced by somebody better or somebody worse? And so you can't abstract Senator Manchin from the people who voted him into office, right? And then are we talking about zazooping all of West Virginia away, right? I think this is, we've got to be open, honest about this. There are large numbers of Americans who, for various reasons, support politicians who do not support action on climate change. I tried to give you one explanation of this, which has to do with a politics of resentment as we've become a more unequal society. And frankly, as climate change has become an issue that's easily associated with globalization and the most educated classes, those who are already doing best, why it's easy for those who feel they've been left out of wealth creation for good reasons, they feel that, right, to scapegoat us for their suffering and to say, like hell, if we're going to do what you want us to do, until you start paying attention and doing better by us, right? So this is the stickiness of these problems. If we want the people who support Manchin or Sinema or McConnell to support a different kind of politician, a different kind of party, we need them to feel less left out, less aggrieved, less unfairly treated. But now let me add another dimension to this. And that has to do with the fact, Wilma, I see, I'll come back to you in a moment, that we have a very long-standing tradition, political, cultural tradition of rugged individualism. in this society, right? And this is not just our society, it's there in Canada, it's there in Australia, it goes back to Britain, right? And experiences in Britain of the 17th century, the revolutions that were fought there, which were carried over to those countries by the colonial settlers. And those traditions mistrust government. And part of the problem with combating climate change, and that's the quote I said, it's a systematic problem. It's not one that can be solved via individual action. If you look at individual action, actually 70–80% of Americans favor individual action to combat climate change. It's only when you talk about strengthening the government, increasing its regulatory scope, and especially involving the United Nations, that a substantial portion of Americans begin to really get off quickly and the opposition to doing something about climate change increases. So this is a deep cultural vein in American politics. It's not the only one, right? Because there's a whole bunch of people who no longer believe this and who are egalitarians and who want the government to redistribute and regulate because they recognize that our society was a much better place when it was doing that. But the people are concentrated in places like West Virginia. The US Constitution amplifies their influence over our politics. It's a hard problem. We're going to have to convince them. And the first step in convincing them, I believe, is convincing them that we don't condescend to them, that we don't treat them unfairly or meanly or have stereotypes about them, right? And so I guess I'm urging caution, Flossie, in just pointing the finger at Senator Manchin and saying it's all you. It goes a lot deeper than that. And frankly, we may exacerbate the problem if we do too much finger wagging as opposed to trying to build understanding.
And
Well,
so Biden is working carefully to do that. Would you not say that?
Sure. Biden is pulled between two masters, right? He's got a whole bunch of progressive constituents and progressive members of Congress who are impatient for him to act decisively. And yet he understands that if he listens to them and them alone, this problem gets worse. It doesn't get better. It's a tricky position to be in.
Yes, I thought you might want to clarify this a little bit. Thank you.
You bet. Wilma, go ahead.
Yeah, we're trying to fix the divide in our country. There's no impetus for that because it means a loss of power for those who are there and benefiting from these divisions. Why can't they begin to alter the let's take West Virginia. Why not begin to switch your economy? Why not begin to invest in re-education and retraining of people? But because that would impact them. It's exactly the way they want it to be right now because that's the source of their power. So I've been trying to think, where can we get the funding? Who would fund progressive ideas? And I can't come up with it because it would be the government, but the government won't do it and can't do it now.
Yeah, I guess we gotta hope maybe Bloomberg, Bezos, etc. The liberal plutocrats might do something about this to counteract the conservative plutocrats. Unfortunately, the world we live in is one in which money plays such an important role in our politics that it's very easy for those who are profiting from things that are collectively self-destructive to nevertheless manipulate us into supporting those policies or opposing the policies that would lead to a change in our economy. Now, let me add one more thing here, and I just to kind of underline how right you are in framing the issue in this way, Wilma. which is when you look at the countries who've been most successful in generating support for proactive climate change policy, and then I'll take Spain as an example. 80–90% of the Spanish favor these kinds of policies. Part of what they've done is to be proactive about addressing the economic vulnerability that these policies might generate. And so Spain, and it's not Spain alone, but I'll use Spain as an example, has a quote, climate change transition ministry at the level of its government. And so what it is doing is funding, and Spain has a fairly large coal sector, right, in its economy. And part of the problem here, right, when you look at this, is the societies that are most skeptical about this have that rugged individualistic tendency, have substantial dependency on petroleum within their economy, or fossil fuels, and are, at least up until now, it appears, least immediately impacted by climate change. And so it's a multi-factor analysis. But what Spain has done, doesn't have all of that going against it, is to take its coal miners and to say proactively, we're going to get you into new industries. We're going to get you new jobs. We're going to make sure that you get re-educated. So this is not just some urban elites telling you your jobs are going away, but actually a society-wide solidaristic effort to face a collective problem, but not make any individuals bear a disproportionate share of the cost. That's what we need. Unfortunately, right, our politics mitigates against that possibility. Matt, go ahead.
Okay, I haven't heard anything at all about geoengineering in this entire presentation. And of course, any nation could solve the problem for the whole world overnight if they wanted to. But I know of only one nation that really could do that job, and that's China. And they don't have to worry that much about democracy. They don't have to worry too much about contaminating some more or less worthless land out in the western part of the country. And I think they have all of the necessary to temporarily at least solve this problem for the world in a way that will have some nasty side effects. But are the side effects anywhere near as bad as the actual problem? I don't think so.
So Matt, can I ask you to be concrete about what kind of geoengineering proposal you're speaking about? And just so everybody's on the same page, right?
Okay.
This is re-engineering the planet so that it absorbs less heat from the sun or radiates more of it back out. But what specifically do you have in mind?
Well, I think it's well accepted that if you can put a bunch of sulfuric acid particles into the stratosphere, it will cool the Earth. That's happened repeatedly with volcanic eruptions. And the Chinese could set off a fake volcano very easily out in the western provinces with a nuclear explosive. They could create the effect of a major volcanic eruption pretty much anytime they wanted to. I've been watching carefully some of the satellite pictures of developments out there where they're digging holes in the ground, wondering what they actually are for. People have been saying they're missile silos, but I'm wondering whether they're launching pads for at least a temporary response to global warming. I think it's interesting that we talk about cooperation throughout the entire world when this particular response requires no cooperation of anybody.
So let me speak to this for a moment. And I don't know if you're aware, Matt, but Elizabeth Colbert, the environmental writer for the New Yorker and a Pulitzer Prize winner, the sixth great extinction, among other things, the famous books published by her. Her most recent book, only I think a year old, is called Under a White Sky. And the premise of her book is, on the one hand, climate change is so out of control and our political will so lacking that we may have no choice but to try geoengineering, try to alter the major systems at a planetary level to force the planet to bounce more of the sun's energy off before it gets to the surface of the planet, for instance. And hence the title, Under a White Sky. One of the things she points out is once you put the sulfur into the atmosphere, the sky is no longer blue, right? But another thing she points out is, look, the times this has happened in the past, it's been very short-lived, right? We need this not for a few years, not for a decade, but maybe for centuries. And then she points out, look, these major volcanic eruptions at points may have triggered ice ages, may have triggered mass extinctions as well, right? And so we don't know what the unintended consequences are going to be, and whether the unintended consequences could potentially be as catastrophic, maybe considerably less catastrophic, but still substantial when compared with global climate change. And so you're absolutely right. Today's lecture was not about geoengineering or about the kind of Hail Mary effort to combat this. The other thing we could talk about is carbon capture, right? And again, technologically, we're not there yet, but we can hope that eventually we'll get to the place where we might be able to efficiently take some of the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere that we put into it. But we can't do it at a scale that matters without devoting so much money and so many resources to it that we should really concentrate instead on just electrifying everything and getting our electrical sources to be clean. That's much more efficient. So yes, I think you may be right that if we continue down the path we're on, we're going to have no choice but to engage in geoengineering. I just am very, very cautious about experimentation on a planetary scale, given the law of unintended consequences. We don't know what it's going to do to us. But you're right, Matt. We may have to do this. All right, we went half an hour over. It's lovely as always being with you. I'm sorry that today was such a sober topic, but it's something we do need to continue talking about. By the way, one of the takeaways here is that we who believe this need to become as focused on this in our politics as the members of the NRA are focused on electing people who are pro-gun rights. If we did that, we are a much larger segment of the population than are the people who deny climate change, right? And so one of the things we need to do is move this up our priority list and say, we're not going to vote for people unless and until they make pledges, credible pledges, that they will make this their #1 political priority. If we can combine that with beginning to have a little bit more sympathy, a little bit more understanding, a little bit more credibility with the people in our society who are skeptical about us, we could see a very different politics emerging over the next decade. All right, everybody. Take care. Have good weeks.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you next week. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, guys. Take care. Bye-bye.
Everybody.